Hello and welcome to Seattle City Makers. I'm your host, Jon Scholes. Well, welcome to episode 20, everybody. We continue to have just a great time in bringing this podcast to you and bringing conversations with leaders across the city of Seattle that are shaping how we experience our city, leaders from sports and entertainment and real estate and business, development. And today, we're going to talk politics. It's election season after all, both locally at the state level and, of course, nationally. And we thought, what better time to talk politics than in this season? And I'm joined in episode 20 by Sandeep Kaushik, who is a public affairs and political consultant here in the city of Seattle. He's worked on a number of ballot measures for elected officials, for campaigns on behalf of coalitions. If you voted for a tax measure in the city of Seattle or in King County, chances are Sandeep has probably worked on that. And he has helped elect mayors and county executives and helped pass the preschool campaign to fund universal preschool in the city of Seattle and the Metropolitan Parks District. And before that, he was communications director for King County Executive Ron Sims. He was a reporter with The Stranger here in Seattle and also the Seattle correspondent for Time Magazine and the Boston Globe. He lives in Seattle in Finney Ridge with his wife and two kids, serves on the board of the Downtown Emergency Services Center, and got his BA from Reed and an MA in history from Princeton University. And we talk about mostly local politics, but also get Sandeep's insight on a national race, a congressional race that he's working on at the national level down in Southwest Washington, and get his take on the state of Seattle politics as we look ahead to the races on the ballot this November, a King County prosecutor's race and others, but also 7 of our 9 city council members facing re-election in November of 2023. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Sandeep Kaushik. Well, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, happy to do it.
And you've spent most of your career, if I have this right, on local politics, working for candidates, elected officials, local measures.
Yeah, local. I've done most of my work on ballot measure stuff, either statewide or local. I've done some congressional races. I'm doing right now. The one race I'm working on is the congressional race in the 3rd congressional district down in Southwest Washington, which is a very hot race where Jamie Herrera Butler, the incumbent Republican, got bounced in the primary. And so now this is very extreme MAGA Republican Joe Kent against my candidate, Marie Perez. And so,
you got some Republicans.
We do, yeah. There's a Seattle Times story about Republican crossover. We don't win that district unless we can get Republican-leaning independents and moderate Republicans to cross over and vote for Marie. But we think, given how extreme Joe is and Marie's message of inclusiveness and moderation, we think we've got a shot.
So, a lot happening nationally, and you're working on that race. But since the title of our podcast is Seattle City Makers, I wanted to get your take, mostly at a local level, but maybe we'll veer into some of the national stuff.
Yeah.
And, there's some notable local races on the ballot this year. We're nearly a year away from a pretty significant shift in politics in Seattle with the election of our Mayor Harrell and his new city attorney and city council member.
And we have 7 city council races.
And then we look ahead. So plenty going on both nationally and locally. And maybe just a place to start is, how would you describe kind of the state of politics in Seattle today? Like the sentiment of the average voter.
I think the voters in Seattle right now are very, very frustrated and unhappy. And feel like the problems that the city's facing, have been getting steadily worse over time. I think it's probably a little bit, the mood is probably a little bit better now than it was this time last year. I saw some polling back, I think it was October, right before the elections last year, where the approval rating of the city council was down in the low 20s, 22%, something like that.
Have you seen it that low before?
I've never seen it that low. Yeah. I mean, that's historically horrible. I mean, I've done campaigns for a long time, and to see numbers that bad, typically it's in the, even in when it's bad before, in sort of bad periods, it was high 30s, early, lower 40s kind of thing. So to be down at 22% is kind of disastrously bad. And I think it's probably a bit better than that now, kind of high 20s, not low 20s, but it's still, by historical standards, atrocious.
Not good.
Those are terrible numbers, right? And so I do think, I think anybody that's an incumbent elected official in the city of Seattle right now needs to be thinking about why the voters are so upset, disappointed, angry, disaffected, whatever, terminology you want to use there. And so, yeah, I think look, I just tweeted this morning, there was a poll the Oregonian published about their hot city council race, where they've got an incumbent, Joanne Hardesty, who's been sort of a leader of the police, the anti-cop sort of defund faction, kind of roughly occupies the same space that Councilmember Sawant occupies in their political universe. And she's losing to her challenger, who's running entirely on crime and encampments. I think the number was 48-22 in the Oregonian poll. I mean, now that's not an exact bellwether because it is, she is a uniquely sort of polarizing figure down there in the way, say, Councilmember Sawant is up here. But it's a big red flag and a warning sign,
Well, you bring up the point of other progressive cities where voters are also frustrated and unhappy. We're seeing this in San Francisco.
Absolutely.
The San Francisco Chronicle did a pretty extensive poll of voters down there that they did a lot of reporting on over the last several weeks. And Portland, you mentioned, and LA. And so, I mean, what do you make of that, where these big shifts in voter attitudes in cities with a lot in common, where the politics were all sort of headed in one direction for quite some time?
Yeah, the blue city blues.
Does it shift? Does it shift back, or is this a moment in time of voters being sort of heavily focused on a few issues that they're frustrated about?
Yeah. I think there are, at the top of the list is homelessness, of course, and then crime, I think, are the two biggest issues, not just here in Seattle, but in blue progressive cities like San Francisco and Portland, Los Angeles, and, name the city. Even on our West Coast cities share a particular sort of set of problems related to those issues, but even in East Coast cities, they're facing the same kind of problems. You look at Eric Adams' numbers in New York City, for instance, and I think there's deep frustration with homelessness there in New York, and and crime, and that's affecting his numbers, or Philly, or wherever. So yeah, look, my take on what happened is I think the entire ruling class of Seattle had a bout of temporary insanity in 2020. I think they went off the frickin' deep end, right? And embraced a set of kind of wacko, radical, positions in the name. I think the motivations were well intentioned, right, and rooted in something real, which is anxiety about what Trump was doing to the country and to our democracy, which is, I think he's terrible, a uniquely toxic figure, and the destruction he was causing. And then we had, on top of that, COVID, and then the murder of George Floyd, which created, I think, a very legitimate and righteous, revulsion and reaction on the part of progressive voters all over the country, including places like Seattle. So I think all of that was rooted in something real. But where it ended up going was in cloud cuckoo land, right? Where suddenly the cops only exist, their only function is to, oppress minority folks, and that we should just get rid of them and everything will be better. And, all of that stuff, I think, was there was a moment when you couldn't speak up against that and say, wait a minute, that seems kind of crazy. Like what's going on here? And so yes, I do think there's a recalibration going on, and I think it's still happening even after, I think largely our elections last year in 2021 were about this, right? About coming back from that, crazy cloud cuckoo land, la la land brink. But I don't think it's fully been digested yet by the political leadership of this city. What people are sort of rebelling against or what they're concerned about. So anyway, I think we're in the midst of something.
When do you think those newly elected office, who are now the incumbents, our new mayor, city attorney, new city council member, who ran on these issues, really had specific ideas. They highlighted dealing with homelessness, dealing with public safety in their platforms. When do they start to wear more of the responsibility, or do you think the frustration is that voters are feeling is still kind of a hangover from the last administration,
20,
and when generally, should incumbents start to worry that, okay, these favorable ratings or the right track, wrong track, the frustration is directed at me and not the last folks in my seat?
It's a very good question. I do think, and we saw in some polling earlier this year, a really sharp distinction between the newcomers, right? The Mayor Harrell, City Attorney Ann Davison, and her, kind of trying to restore some balance to, how we do our municipal system of criminal justice, or Sarah Nelson, who was trying to kind of moderate the sort of radicalism or the kind of the supermajority sort of movement left council kind of positions. And we saw those folks polling really well, whereas everybody else had numbers that were in the anybody that was on the council and voted or pledged to cut the SPD by 50%. I think they all have issues that they're going to have to grapple with in 2023 when they're up for re-election. So I think there's been a honeymoon for a while, particularly for the mayor, but it's not going to last forever. I don't know exactly when it ends, but at the end of the day, elected officials in municipal governance and local governance get judged by how people are feeling about the condition of the city. And when I walk around Pioneer Square right now, my office is down in the square, it doesn't feel that great, man. I mean, people digging through garbage cans, people smoking fentanyl. I walked in the alley behind my building in the broad daylight the other day, and there's like a woman performing a sex act on a dude by the garbage cans, which is not like a touching moment of two lovebirds getting carried away, but it's like a sordid sex for drugs kind of transaction happening by the dumpsters, and and I'm like, that's not that great, right? Like, it doesn't give me a good feeling about the neighborhood I'm working in, and so what I worry is that that's becoming the new normal in Seattle, and that there's a sort of sense that we're supposed to accept this as just the sort of status quo ante of what life is like downtown or in the square
big
or
cities,
Belltown.
big problems.
Big city, big problems. And all the real solutions are only these kind of long-term upstream interventions so we can't really...
Whose perspective is that? You're not saying that's voters. You're saying
I'm saying that
policymakers?
Certain policymakers, and I'm saying that's the kind of
these are
standard,
too hard to solve, and there's
or that the only interventions that we should be doing are therapeutic or socially uplifting, right? And that there's no place for any kind of that the ordinary work of, say, the criminal justice system, right? That all of our that it's all carrot and no stick, right? And I think that's been the very naive position that a significant chunk of the left in the city has taken since 2019, 2020, and whether you go back to completely defunding the navigation teams. When that happened, we had I don't think she was president. Yeah, she was president of the council, Lorena Gonzalez, who ran for mayor last year. On the dais, said defunding the navigation teams would lead to fewer encampments in the city of Seattle.
Right.
The navigation teams had already failed, and this kind of approach of sort of, for lack of a better term, touchy-feely outreach that we're going to implement is going to be 1,000 times better, and voters are going to see fewer encampments. Well, I remember watching at the time thinking, God, I think she really believes this. It's hard to know, but I think she really believes it. And I think that's crazy. That's not going to work.
It certainly was a failed experiment.
It's a failed experiment. I think.
But it seems like voters both in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco are really embracing a much more balanced, nuanced approach, right? And
absolutely. Look, Seattle is a very progressive city. That has not changed. I don't think when I said the ruling class lost its mind in 2020, I mean, maybe your average progressive voter too, there was a moment where they were like, yeah, maybe we do need these kind of radical changes. But by and large, I think the voters of Seattle have been pretty consistent going back the 10 years I've been, more than 10 years now that I've been doing mayoral races, dating back to 2009. It's really significant elements of what I would call Seattle's ruling class, or Seattle's sort of progressive establishment or movement left establishment that have radicalized, right, and kind of lost touch with their own voters. And I think I've said this before, the kind of incentive and reward structure for left council members, left bloc council members, is often more about appeasing a constellation of progressive interest groups or activist groups than it is, even when that diverges with what their constituents want them to do. They sort of see their bread being buttered by this sort of movement left kind of infrastructure, which is a credit to how successful the progressive left has been in sort of building a municipal machine, right? A municipal political machine to sort of dominate the agenda at City Hall. And I think they've run circles around the business community for a decade plus on that front, right? But they've also lost touch, I think, now.
Overreach.
And aren't, in some sense, have been kind of gaslighting their own progressive voters, saying there's no, if you say there's a problem about crime or there's a problem about encampments, you're some kind of, heartless, reactionary sellout. And that works for a while, but eventually, people are like, the emperor has no clothes here.
It certainly didn't work last November.
Yeah, it didn't work last November.
You said something earlier about, if you're a leader of municipal government, if you're a local elected official with voters, it's, generally about results. And is the quality of life in my city, are you picking up the good? Are you picking up the trash? Are you plowing the snow, or is it safe? And that's largely been true, but it seemed of the last, prior to the last election, we'd been in this period where it was kind of less about that. I'm kind of test this theory out with you, see what you think. Yeah. Less about that and more about this sort of identity politics, which we're much more accustomed to at the national level of, are you for this or against that, and sort of check these boxes. And candidates would run sort of putting out this identity and this image. And you were sort of judged on that, and voters would judge them on that, not whether they could implement solutions to problems necessarily. And my theory to some degree around that is kind of the Trump effect of him being in office, and he was so polarizing at the national level that local elections became sort of nationalized. And it was sort of, mayors and council members positioning themselves as the foil or the counter to Trump at a national level. And we kind of lost touch with, but are you going to pick up the trash, and how are you going to help keep the park open, and how are you going to actually deliver the basics of government? And now that Trump is still Trump, and he's very much in the political conversation, but he's not in the office, and the issues in a lot of cities because of the pandemic and other things have become much more challenged as far as their impact on the lives of day-to-day residents. And do you think that has something to do with kind of this shift back to, are you going to get the basics done, and how are you going to do them, versus, these are the boxes you check and as a candidate?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think things got super ideological, right, in our politics for a while, right? And whenever I meet with somebody who's thinking about running for office, in the city or else in the city, I tell them there's really only two kinds of candidates that win races in the city of Seattle, and one is what I would call kind of, there's a left activist kind of lane, and it's about a style of politics that is really very ideological and very focused on kind of as much about sort of symbolism and identity and purity, than it is about sort of delivering results, right? And you can win in that lane. Councilmember Sawant is a really good example of somebody who's demonstrated an ability to kind of run in her district and win doing that kind of politics. With I don't think Councilmember Sawant gives a gives a hoot about constituent services or like what's happening, with the small businesses in her,
And barely survived her recall,
yeah, she
right?
barely survived recall. But
is it your take if that she had an opponent on that?
I think
on
she's
that ballot in December.
I do think she's in trouble next year. Yeah. I actually think I don't know that I loved every decision that recall campaign sort of made in terms of their messaging and stuff. But beyond that, I think there's just a general aversion a significant chunk of voters have to the idea of recalling a duly elected official. It feels anti-democratic, and well, she won, so and elections have consequences. But I do think all the polling I've seen about her favorability is really pretty poor, even in her own district. Citywide, her numbers are terrible. Her district and District 2, which is southeastern Seattle, are probably about 20 points farther left than the rest of the city. I mean, they're much younger and much more, as you say, kind of in that ideological warrior kind of politics that appeals.
And you
to
still
those
think
voters.
that lane kind of exists for a certain type of
It does
candidate
exist, yeah.
in
Now,
Seattle.
but it does exist.
Yeah.
But I think the majority of the city is still in the other lane, which is still a progressive lane, but it's a kind of center left, I would call culturally traditional lane, right? The ideological kind of left activist lane really embraces all of this kind of this new era of what I would call cultural cosmopolitanism. And it's this set of ideas that are very, very prevalent among younger people in urban areas, or ideas around gender fluidity and anti-capitalism and all of this kind of I would say it's a kind of utopian vision of creating this brave new world or this new counterculture that they're going to create, of this sort of urban world in which they want to live. There are a lot of folks that embrace all of that stuff, but there's still a lot of people that are pretty progressive, kind of traditional liberal sorts that are also, but culturally traditional, that don't think all of the institutions of American society are corrupted and fallen.
Need to be blown up.
Yeah, need to be blown
right.
up. Like they like to, watch a football game and have a beer, and don't kind of make disparaging comments about sports ball or what, right? I mean, it's so I still think that's the majority of the city. They're very progressive voters. These are voters that are like, vote for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or maybe, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, but they're left.
They're Democrats.
Yeah. They're strong Democrats. But they're more like, hey, I just want to have a good quality of life and I want to be able to go to my park without, kind of walking across needles. And I'm kind of wondering what's happened with the proliferation of these encampments around the city or what have you, right? Or what's going on with housing and housing costs or, the range of problems that we face.
It seems that another sort of tension between the far left and other progressive Democrats, maybe the majority progressive Democrats in cities over the last many years, is this sort of tendency or interest by the far left to sort of use local tools, policies to sort of right the wrongs of the past at a national level, federal issues. And it's this very strategic sort of maneuvering and agenda, I think, by the far left, which I would suggest, takes sort of the eye off the ball of delivering sort of the day-to-day services and local results. And there's been kind of this tension there between the folks who are sympathetic to broader systemic issues in our country, but also want their park opened and want safe streets and communities and
deal with the basics.
Sort of the basics. And also, and at the federal level, we need to be doing much more to invest in affordable housing and mental health and major changes at the federal level from a policy perspective. Right. But sort of this tension between the role of local government in delivering on a day-to-day versus how it's been sort of utilized or desired to be utilized by some on the far left.
Yeah, as a place of to a certain extent, policy experimentation and innovation, is a good thing, right? We want to, and cities are kind of laboratories where you can sometimes test out things that might be, a bridge too far politically, at the state or federal level, or and at those levels, cities are still places where it's not so easy to get stuff done in Seattle anymore, but you can still do pretty big things.
You can
here.
Move faster,
yeah,
right?
You can move faster. Whereas even in Olympia, things seem pretty polarized, and certainly at the federal level, it's incredibly dysfunctional, and so. So a lot of that is to the good, but I think where it goes bad is where cities then become kind of petri dishes or guinea pigs for, experiments, some fairly radical experiments in governance that don't necessarily have particularly broad public support either, right? But are cooked up by kind of activist groups or leaning groups, and they're like, well, let's just do this in Seattle, kind of without doing our homework about, is this stuff going to work? Have we thought out all the policy? What are the unintended consequences of some of these policy moves? What kind of negative feedback could happen? And it's more like, hey, it's the shiny new thing. Let's kind of shoot first and then, figure out what the damage is later, right? I think there is some of that goes on in places like Seattle. We see this with the city council all the time, where they'll get their private executive briefings where the city attorneys will come in and tell them this thing you want to do is probably illegal, right? And then they're like, to hell with it, we're going to do it anyway, right?
It becomes a positioning exercise.
Yeah, it gets rolled back 2 or 3 years later in the courts, but there's no I get the win now, right? And all the, Twitter is aflame with how I did this great thing. And then 3 years later, the courts say, this is crazy, you can't, and illegal, and you can't do it. But there's no consequences 3 years from now. So we might as well just push the envelope of legality. And that's happened time and time again. I mean, John, you and I have both seen that happen in a number of policy areas. And you're just kind of like, well, maybe you should pay some attention to what's really in our, permit, and what's probably going to just end up costing our constituents and taxpayers a lot of money and end up being kind of performative without ever delivering anything of benefit. And I think there's been too much of that latter kind of stuff that's happened in city politics. And I do think that feeds into the negative perceptions of the city council, the performative BS stuff.
So speaking of the council, we're soon going to be in the election cycle where 7 of 9 are up in 23, and as the calendar turns in the new year, that will sort of focus everybody's attention on those races. What do you expect to see as far as the volume of candidates, the types of candidates, and if you're advising a candidate, what's the profile, set of messages, platform that you're encouraging, that you think is going to ensure success at the ballot?
It depends on whether I'm talking with an incumbent who's running or whether I'm talking to a challenger, right? But I think the message, the sweet spot for both is still the same politically, right? And that is to get back to a place where, you can be progressive, but you don't want to come across as an ideologue, right? And that's where, I have progressive values. I want to translate those progressive values into an active and engaged governance. But I also want, as you said, make sure we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's and making sure the potholes in my district are getting filled, or making sure if there's stuff happening in our neighborhood business districts with, I live in Finney Ridge, and there was 6 months ago, walk down the street and all of a sudden all the plate glass windows on a number of the stores in our district had all been smashed out, at the Ken's Market. These people had broken in through the glass door, and they'd stolen a forklift from the hardware store next door and drove it in, and it was all captured on the cameras.
Chaos up north there.
And grabbed the ATM machine and cleared off with it. Yeah. This is like a block from my house, right? And Ken still doesn't have an ATM. I went to go get money at the ATM machine at Ken's the other day, and I was like, oh, there's no ATM. And I was like, so you guys just didn't replace it after they stole? And he was like, yeah, we're not putting an ATM.
More trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, more trouble than it's worth. We're not going to do that. So I think there is a sense of, we want progressive governance, but we want governance that's focused on delivering concrete, tangible results, right? Tell me what you're really... Don't tell me that we can't clean up an encampment ever again until we build housing for, some mythical era when everybody has a the penthouse of Trump Tower to live in. Otherwise, if you start saying that, which is I think what the left sounds like to a lot of people these days.
Well, it's
that's not going to go over well when people are really frustrated. And I do think, if things don't, I think people feel like city government is too reactive. They don't have, what's the plan?
Where's the plan?
Even when there's sort of initiatives, and I will say this is, I think, a concern for the mayor and his team, right? They came in, and I think there was some low-hanging fruit for them to get at, and doing the emphasis patrols and stuff. I know that you all at the DSA were really hoping for was to see some action around 3rd and Pike and Pine, and 2nd and 3rd and Pike and Pine, and they did. But then, that lasts a few months. Then they have to pull the cops back. And now it's kind of all back, right? The activity, maybe not quite at the level it was.
But we certainly still face challenges.
I was just down there at the Triple Door and Wild Ginger day before yesterday in the evening, and I was like, ooh, I looked down the alley and there's all these people smoking fentanyl and like what, I was like, oh, it's kind of back, right? So I don't, I'm like, what is the longer term game plan here to do better? And I don't think, even on the moderate side, I don't think you can just say, oh, we're just going to do more sweeps, right? Or we're going to just, because I think a lot of progressive voters do I feel like that's not enough. That's just kind of ultimately moving stuff around, and it's not going to lead. So it's got to be something more broader and more integrated.
And it seems like voters, their expectation for details, like you said, of how are you going to do it?
Yeah.
Not just what are you going to do and sort of the higher level commitments, but how's it going to get done? And what's the next step? And by when? That expectation is even higher.
Show me that you have
sort of correlated to frustration, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's been this whole effort about downtown, right? And we were going to get, visible homelessness off the streets of downtown by, I think it's supposed to be by the end of this year. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? So what's the game plan to kind of get there? And I actually think if we can implement some stuff, and I think it was a smart idea to say, let's take a focused geographical area like downtown that is very important to our economy, but where we have some significant problems that have emerged. And let's demonstrate that we can, in this contained area, fix the problem. And I think if you do that, you can go back to the voters and then say, we figured out a pathway here. Now we would like to ask you for the resources to expand that effort so that we can replicate our success here, in other parts of the city. And I think that's a recipe or a prescription to get, because I do think ultimately to address problems like encampments, and we are going to need more resources, right? I mean,
and to bring people inside, not just move them around.
Yeah,
park to park.
The scale of the problem is really big, right? I mean, you and I both know, we're both on the DSC board, that while there's a lot of money that does get spent on homelessness now, and maybe not every dollar is spent in exactly the best way possible, fundamentally, if we're really going to do the kind of interventions we need to do to get some of these people that are that have real significant issues on our streets, whether it's mental health or chronic, addiction, and now we're talking about not even heroin and cocaine, but fentanyl and meth, which have just exacerbated the kind of the depths of those problems, I think, for a lot of individual folks who are suffering on our streets. So it is going to take resources, but it's you got to demonstrate. You got to demonstrate that you know what the hell you're doing before I think the public's going to be super excited about opening up their pocketbooks and just sort of giving you a blank check to do more stuff. And I know, John, this is something you all have been working on, pretty intensively for a while now. And I think it's doable, right? I mean, there are some approaches that we know work, but let's figure out how to, activate those and make them happen.
Yeah, and take it to scale and sustain it and commit. And it seems like there's such broad agreement in the city around the approach. I think most people, I think we were in this sort of either-orism of politics over the last several years, where you were some electeds would sort of say, well, you're either for helping the homeless or you're for open, clean parks that you can use, but you can't, right? We can't have both.
Right.
And the public, I think, in the last election sort of said, nope.
We want both.
We want both. We deserve both. And if you can't deliver both, we'll find somebody who can, right?
Right. I think that's exactly right. I think that is what they said and what they want.
And and we're moving in the right direction, but certainly plenty of challenges still out there. So just looking at, from your background of being at the Stranger prior
Yeah.
to consulting for
Been a while
candidates
now,
and
yeah.
electeds and ballot measures, I wanted to just get your take. We talked about the state of politics in the city.
Yeah.
What's your take on the state of political coverage and
Yeah.
how does that influence voters and electeds and the interest groups? We certainly have fewer political reporters
Yes.
than we did back when you were at the Stranger, but in some cases more outlets and channels and places for people to get information and to talk about politics, and your podcast included. We should
Yeah.
plug your podcast.
Oh,
right?
yeah. I do a podcast with actually, so if people think I'm some kind of heartless reactionary, I do a podcast with Erica Barnett, who does Publicola, and it's sort of, in some ways, I think the queen of left Twitter in Seattle, right? And we've been friends and colleagues at the Stranger back in the day
Yeah.
for 20 years ago, and so we do a podcast where we argue about municipal politics, and we have strongly different opinions, and sometimes we get heated, but we're old friends, and we've been having this argument in private for 20 years, and so now we just do it with David Hyde from KOW,
Yes,
who moderates
yes.
our conference. We need somebody to
Referee, moderate, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, exactly. So we try to do an episode every week, and if you're interested in municipal politics, please do. Yeah.
So does our municipal politics suffer from
Yeah.
the decline we've
media
seen
question?
and just the landscape? And don't want to. We've got great reporters out there
Totally.
doing great work, but it's a different landscape
It
than it was. We have
is.
fewer newspapers. We have fewer people on the beat in Olympia,
Yeah.
for instance.
Yeah, the legacy media has shrunk a lot, and then there have been a lot of stuff that's popped up in the vacuum that was created by that, but it's very fragmented, right? And so there's lots of like little sites or kind of niche things out there. And the old kind of gatekeeper function that, say, got played by the Seattle Times in the city of Seattle has broken down to a significant extent. I mean, I think the legacy media still throws a lot of weight around. But the other thing that's happened, and this is my source of frustration, is that I think Trump, the ascendancy of Trump nationally, broke a lot of things in America. And I think you've seen things that happen in academia or in the foundation world, or I think in the media as well, in kind of a reaction to Trump that I think have been unfortunate and negative. And one of the things I've seen is there may have been issues with some of the old standards of objectivity and how it worked, right, in the news media. And obviously, The Stranger was never an objective paper. We did advocacy journalism, but
And
still,
we're upfront about that.
I always felt like the emphasis we had a point of view, but the emphasis was on the journalism part, right? When I wrote a story, I would talk to the chair of the Republican Party, and I would, try to get put their best argument. That's sort of a lot of that has been washed away now. And frankly, I see a lot of the legacy media outlets. I tell Erica this, like, her language around defining any encampment cleanup ever under any circumstances is a sweep. Like, she denies that that's her position, but I think she sort of gave a permission slip to people at these ostensibly objective outlets to start adopting that framing and that
carry the
language,
language,
or
yeah.
the language that anybody who diverges at all from kind of left progressive orthodoxy in the city on anything is a conservative, quote unquote conservative, right? You see, I've seen that in the Seattle Times. These people are not conservative. Like, sorry, and I'm not a conservative, right? And to use that framing has a very negative connotation in a progressive city like Seattle.
Right,
And so
with a candidate
you adopted the framing
who's
of
a
one
Democrat,
side,
right? It's like
you've adopted the framing of one side in an ongoing dispute,
Yeah.
and so I think there are a lot of stuff going on, roiling in newsrooms, whether it's KUW or the Seattle Times, where there are now reporters who want to, essentially take a side or advance a position, and so it becomes both in terms of like how stories are framed and the shot selection. Certain stories don't get covered or undercovered because they don't fit the right progressive narrative or whatever. And I find that super frustrating. I'm like, cover the damn story. If there's something significant going on, cover it, whether or not, the side that you're more personally aligned with, benefits or doesn't benefit. I do think there's been a breakdown. I said this right after the last election. I wrote a piece kind of explaining what happened in the last election the day after that happened. And one of our news outlets did an entire story on abolition, right? This idea that we can kind of get rid of our criminal justice system. And it was their social justice reporter, and it was written entirely, a pretty extensive story, without talking to a single person that opposed this idea or had any questions about it, right? It was entirely written as a rah-rah, like, let's talk to the people that are advocating abolition and, give them the microphone to talk about why we should abolish it. And I'm just like, you're ostensibly an objective news outlet. How did this get past, like, the editors, right? Like, on what planet is this sort of a... So anyway, I see more of that. I see certain voices, certain activist voices that get repeatedly amplified as representing particular communities, even though when I look at the research data or something, I find that they don't actually represent the, those minority communities or what have you. And so I'm like, maybe we should actually be spreading out a little bit and talking to kind of ordinary folks in those communities rather than the kind of activist leadership who pretends to speak for them, right? That kind of thing that I think it's become a problem in the city. Look, I think that the Stranger still has really significant influence. They've essentially picked the left lane candidates, right? The Stranger endorsement in city council or mayoral races in the primary carries a huge amount of value. It's usually determinative about who wins the primary.
You think it has the same weight as it did a decade ago?
No, I don't. I do think they've lost some readership, and I do think they've kind of hollowed out somewhat. I think the quality of the Stranger is not, what it was in its heyday. I don't think. There's less content, right? I mean, there's, and there's a lot of fluffy content like
it's not the same publication.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. That said, when it comes to endorsement time, it still has a ton of
They're
impact.
communicating with a significant
It's a very easy
number of
shorthand for
voters.
people to go and I can go vote the Stranger line, right, and the cheat sheet, and so I think they do still have tremendous, last year nobody got through the primaries unless they were endorsed either by the Times or the Stranger.
Yeah.
Interestingly, in this year's legislative races, the Times and the Strangers actually agreed on a number of Seattle races, right? Which is interesting to see. But I do think, they endorsed Nicole Thomas Kennedy for city attorney, which kind of, they almost elected her, city attorney, which I just think is wacko, man. And they had a perfectly, very progressive. I think a lot of people in kind of the DSA world thought too progressive an incumbent city attorney in Pete Holmes, who I had always supported, Pete, and I was a little concerned about how far he'd gone, but when I saw that Stranger for endorsing for NTK,
they abandoned him and
they abandoned him and said, we want to go with this, abolitionist, which would have been a disaster. I mean, she got elected, we've already down 400 cops at SPD. I think that we probably had 100, 200 more cops that would have just quit right off the bat, and then all of the criminal side of the city attorney's office would have exited, if either pushed out by her or just we're not going to work for somebody like this. I mean, you hear internally there's a lot of frustrations within the King County prosecutor's office about how. So imagine electing somebody like NTK to run an institution like that. And I just think our police department would have ended up in receivership, and we wouldn't, it just sounds. So I do think, I will say, I think it was really freaking irresponsible that they endorsed NTK. I think that was crazy. And look, we organized an IE campaign, and we were able to elect a Republican, Ann Davison, city attorney of the city of Seattle. First time a Republican has been elected in Seattle in more than 40 years. And I think Ann has done a good, I was involved in that. I think Ann has done a good job, and I don't think she's some kind of Trumpy,
no, she's
not
been a great leader.
Yeah. I think she's done well. And John, you brought this up. Her whole thing has been, I just want to bring some balance back. We are going to continue to do alternatives to incarceration. We are going to continue to be we can have a very progressive justice system you know, by just even if we dial the ideological stuff back just a couple notches, it's still very progressive, but we're also going to have some accountability, and we're going to have some options when the sort of, help-oriented interventions aren't working with certain people. Then we have to move on to the punitive side, right?
And start to recenter the voice of
That's right.
victims
Bring
and
balance
the
back to
voice
the
of
system.
neighborhoods that are getting
That's
ATMs drug out of their
when you look
grocery
at
store,
like
right?
the mandate for community court, right, in the Seattle Municipal Court, more than half of the crimes committed in the city, those folks are sent to community court, which is a quote unquote release first model of court. And for many of the people sent there for it's 22 categories of misdemeanor crimes now, where essentially everyone gets sent to community court. Most of those people, that's fine. That's a good intervention. And if they're, fulfilling the obligations that for alternatives, and they're not reoffending, that's great. We should be doing that. But you read that 20-page document about community, not one mention of victims of crimes, not one. There's no thought whatsoever, or to the people that have gone to community court and then blew it off, right? But still got released, and then went out and committed more crimes, and then they get sent back, and then they blow it off again, but still, like what happens in those circumstances, right? Like, and there was no thought to that when this whole system was set up. None whatsoever, as far as I can tell. That and that's why things got out of balance.
Yeah, and it sure seems like voters are asking for balance and results. So, quick prediction as we wrap, and then we'll end with our final question that we put to all of our guests, which is your perfect Saturday in Seattle. So you can be thinking of that as you opine on your predictions. The U.S. House and Senate, which party will control at the end on the other side of the November election?
I'm optimistic that Democrats will end up narrowly holding the U.S. Senate at this point. And I think because of atrocious candidates they've nominated who are really unfit for office, like, Herschel Walker and leave the ideology aside. I just think that the
candidate quality.
Yeah, the candidate quality thing is character does matter, and candidate quality does matter. And we'll see what happens in Pennsylvania and in Nevada. Some of these races are very, very close, but I think that these have a decent chance of holding the Senate. I think the race here, the Senate race, may be closer than people think. I think Patty Murray's going to win against Tiffany Smiley, but I don't think it will be the kind of blowout that maybe a lot of people expect. But I would guess that the House will go R. The margin there is so narrow, and there's just the historical pattern has been that the incumbent president, in the midterm, in almost every instance, they've lost seats, which, that said, I'm hopeful the race I'm working on in the third that we will buck that trend, right? And elect a Democrat in a seat currently held by a, relatively moderate Republican in Jamie Herrera Butler, who got bounced in the primary by a very extreme MAGA Republican candidate. So we'll see what happens there. I could see us statewide gaining knock on wood, gaining a Democratic congressional seat. But overall, nationally, I think probably Republicans take Congress.
And then back here at home in the King County prosecutor's race, Jim Farrell, Lisa Mannion. Is this a toss-up? Where do you see this? Where do you see this race going?
So I should say that I endorsed and have given some money to Lisa Mannion in that race. We had it took me a while to decide where I wanted to go in that race. I like Lisa personally. I do think we had a very positive conversation before I endorsed her, and I do think they've recalibrated somewhat in the King County Prosecutor's Office in ways that I thought were positive. And so that said, I'll just be blunt about it. I will not be at all surprised if Jim Farrell wins that race. Right, 2/3 of King County is outside the city of Seattle. We were talking at the beginning of this about that frustration here in the city around crime. Well, it's at least as significant in places like South County, where Farrell is a mayor of Federal Way. And Seattle Times just endorsed Jim Farrell. I think that's a big thing for him. So I don't know. I haven't seen any polling. I don't know what's going to happen in that race. But but I do think the frustration levels around crime and the perception that they've gone too far down the road of permissiveness. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this in other settings, but the jail bookings at the King County Jail have just been capped at this incredibly low level. So even when people are being arrested and for crimes and even convicted, they're not serving any time because we took the COVID era caps and are now basically making those
normalize
them, making them, which means there's just not enough space to house people committing lots of crimes in the city of Seattle, which I do think contributes to the problems that we've been seeing on the streets, not just of Seattle, but in other communities. And we've had, in the spate of gun violence that we've seen, across King County. And so we'll see what happens in that race. Like I said, I'm supporting Lisa, but I understand the frustration that's driving Farrell's candidacy.
And for those interested, we sent questionnaires to both candidates, and their responses are on our website, downtownseattle.org. And also, I think you can find on YouTube a candidate forum that was moderated earlier this month. So to conclude, your perfect Saturday in Seattle, what's the itinerary, Sandeep?
Well, I'll tell you, there was a Saturday a couple years ago when I completed the what I call the Kaushik triathlon.
Was there bourbon involved?
There was bourbon
I knew we'd
involved.
get to the bourbon.
There wasn't bourbon involved. And so what it involved was I did a 6-mile bike ride in the morning down by Gasworks Park with my son, and then I played 9 holes of terrible golf at Interbay, and then I made a 12-minute round trip walk to my local grocery store to buy a bottle of bourbon. There you go. That was my triathlon. So.
But you haven't repeated your perfect Saturday.
I need to. Well, yes. It was very taxing and exhausting for me.
You need to start training.
That was sort of my perfect Saturday. I will repeat that in the future. Yes.
It sounds like a great day.
Yeah.
Sounds like a great. Well, thanks for your perspective and your involvement civically in our community, and for taking time on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's fun.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sandeep, a great guy and somebody with a great political mind. Always enjoy sitting down with Sandeep, and we could have gone on for another hour, I'm sure. As I do each and every episode, I want to close out with something you can't miss in downtown. This could be something new, or in this case, something that has recently reopened. And I want to plug the bookstore Bar and Cafe down on First Avenue in the ground floor of the historic, gorgeous Alexis Hotel. I got to the bookstore earlier this week. They've just recently reopened. I don't know exactly when, but I think it's been fairly recent. And food will come soon. They're doing drinks now. Great coffee and cocktails, and a small but mighty wine list, and great beers on draft. It's one of my favorite spots in downtown, and perfect as we enter the cooler, darker, at some point wetter months of the season here. It's a cozy little bar and cafe, and they don't sell books, but plenty of great literature on the shelves. If you want to grab one, I think they allow you to read them. You've got some board games if you are into that sort of thing, and just a nice little spot in the Alexis Hotel, which is just a gorgeous property built in 1901 as a office building, and then in the 80s turned into a hotel. And fun fact, John Graham, the architect of the Space Needle and the Westin Hotel, kept an office there back in the day. So gorgeous historic property downtown on one of my favorite streets, First Avenue. Check out the bookstore. Bar and Cafe, now reopened. Don't know exactly their hours, but serving drinks, and they say food will be back soon. So check it out and go support a business that made it through and has got their doors reopened. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of Seattle City Makers, presented by the Downtown Seattle Association, with support from James Sudo and production by Spark Creative.